here in Seminole County, a man who was sentenced to die, literally was on death row, has had all charges against him dropped.
From the moment that I gave a statement, they actually went out and started hiding the truth about my innocence.
The day was February 4th, 1983, when a Texas worker was stabbed to death while working the night shift. One eyewitness named Carlos as the assailant. However, law enforcement grabbed the wrong Carlos and sentenced him to death. Years later, the real Carlos surfaced, changing the trajectory of this case forever. Here's the heartbreaking reality faced by innocent death row inmates, condemned for crimes they've never committed.
And there are two parents who want this Christmas to go away.
My little girl was crying, "Daddy, Daddy." When I woke up, the whole house was in smoke.
Todd Willingham's case falls into that category where there is not one iota of evidence that the fire was arson. Not one iota.
Now you see, back in 1991, a fire broke out early one morning in Corsicana, Texas, home to 23-year-old Cameron Todd Willingham. Inside were Willingham, his twins Carmen and Cameron, and his daughter, Amber. Now, witnesses say they saw Cameron desperately trying to re-enter the blazing house to save his children, failing despite his efforts. Even after firefighters arrived, he continued attempting to get inside and had to be restrained for his own safety. One firefighter remarked that the intensity of the fire made such an attempt incredibly dangerous. Now, unfortunately, the fire claimed the lives of all three children who died from smoke inhalation. Willingham's wife, 22-year-old Stacy Kendall, had left the house earlier that morning to run errands. At the time, Stacy worked at a bar, and Cameron was an unemployed auto mechanic. Financially struggling, the couple lacked the resources to afford funeral expenses. But to their luck, the tight-knit town they lived in, located roughly 55 miles north of Waco, came together to raise funds for their children's funerals. It was a great gesture, but little did Willingham know his worst fears were about to come to life. The investigation into the fire was led by Douglas Fogg, Corsicana's assistant fire chief, and Manuel Vasquez, a deputy fire marshal. Now, they determined that liquid accelerant had been poured into the children's bedroom, under their beds, and down the hallway toward the front door. The pattern, which they called a fire barrier, suggested the fire was deliberately set to trap the children inside. Laboratory analysis detected mineral spirits, commonly found in lighter fluid, on materials collected from the scene. The heartbreaking incident was now labeled a triple homicide. Prosecutors argued that Willingham was responsible, relying on weak, circumstantial evidence to build their case. They cited his interest in heavy metal music, evidenced by posters of Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin in his house, as some indication of supposed satanic tendencies. Now, Willingham was convicted of murdering his daughters and sentenced to death. However, before his execution, his defense attorney sought out Dr. Gerald Hurst, a highly respected scientist and fire investigator, to re-examine this case. Hurst concluded that the fire was accidental, likely caused by a space heater. While Fire Marshal Vasquez had initially claimed the heater was turned off, Willingham's wife, Stacy, distinctly remembered leaving it on and even setting it lower, because Amber frequently placed objects too close to it. Dr. Hurst told the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole that there was no credible evidence for arson, warning him that Willingham was about to be executed based on flawed science. But despite that, the board unanimously approved the execution, and in 2004, Willingham was put to death by lethal injection. His final wish before he died was for his parents not to attend, and left them with a final request: to continue fighting to clear his name and to scatter some of his ashes over his daughters' graves. Later that same year, the Chicago Tribune consulted 3 fire experts to review the original investigation. Now, their findings aligned with Hurst's, concluding the fire was actually accidental. The Innocence Project later hired 4 additional fire experts, all of whom determined that the evidence cited by Fogg and Vasquez as proof of arson was scientifically baseless and made absolutely no sense. In 2005, Texas established a commission to examine forensic errors. and Willingham's case became its first investigation. Craig Baylor, a fire scientist, reviewed the case and criticized the original investigation. He found no scientific support for the arson claim, stating that Fogg and Vasquez ignored key evidence, relied on outdated myths, and used reasoning more inclined to mystics or psychics. He would also note that their investigation failed to meet not only current standards, but even those of the 1990s. How heartbreaking is this? He didn't only lose his 3 children, but they took him out as well, all due to some accident he couldn't even comprehend. And as crazy as that sounds, our tragedy doesn't end here, because Stacy Kukendall, the sole surviving member of this poor family, now carries the unbearable burden of losing everyone she once loved in just a few short years. Welcome to August 22, 1993, and Texas has just carried out its 5th execution of a teenage offender. The young man's last request for bubblegum was denied, and his final declaration of innocence was silenced forever. The process was seamless, but there was one glaring issue. Texas had executed the wrong person. Now, the person in question was Ruben Cantu, a man who was raised in a modest trailer park on Briggs Street in the southern part of San Antonio, Texas. This rough neighborhood, riddled with bullet-ridden homes, was home to many drug dealers, smugglers, and thieves. So while Cantu's father worked tirelessly into the night, young Ruben skipped school, spending his days learning the harsh lessons of street life. The Eagles, a local gang, held sway over the area, and Cantu, despite his age, quickly rose to prominence within their ranks. He experimented with drugs readily available through local dealers and indulged in joyrides with stolen cars. By 15, he was involved in an auto theft ring, becoming well known and deeply disliked by law enforcement. His notoriety skyrocketed when he shot and injured an off-duty police officer during a bar fight. However, that case fell apart due to evidence tampering by overzealous officers who wanted nothing more than to see him behind bars. And not long after, Cantu found himself entangled in a case of capital murder. On November 8, 1984, Juan Moreno, a hardworking boy who had recently arrived from Zacatecas, Mexico, was staying in this unfinished house near Cantu's trailer. Moreno and his friend Pedro Gomez had eaten dinner and fallen asleep in the empty building they were helping to construct for Moreno's brother and sister-in-law. However, later that night, they were abruptly awakened when 2 Latino boys enter, one of whom held a .22 caliber rifle. These intruders demanded money, and Gomez, a father of 3 daughters back in Mexico, handed over his wallet, which contained $600. He then tried retrieving a .38 caliber revolver hidden beneath the mattress, but before he could, one of those boys shot Gomez 9 times. The shooter then turned the rifle on Moreno, firing repeatedly before fleeing the scene. Moreno was badly injured, but despite those injuries, he managed to stumble outside for help, where a police officer had found him and rushed him to a hospital. Now, fast forward a few days later, and Moreno, who's barely able to speak due to his injuries, informed the cops that the intruders were 2 young Mexican-American teenagers who appeared to live nearby. Homicide officer James Herring, who was assigned to this case, picked up on some rumors circulating that Cantu was one of these attackers and the primary shooter. Acting on this hearsay, they present Moreno with a photo lineup on December 16, 1984, and Moreno, still visibly shaken and traumatized, failed to identify Cantu. Weeks later, Moreno was shown another lineup that again included Cantu's photo, and yet he still doesn't recognize him as the shooter. It wouldn't be until the 3rd photo lineup that Moreno identified Cantu as the shooter, which didn't make sense, given his previous failed attempts to do so. Nonetheless, Cantu was arrested and charged with the murder. The investigation was riddled with inconsistencies and oversights. Witnesses who could have provided an alibi for Cantu were never interviewed. No physical evidence, not even a fingerprint or a bullet, connected him to the crime. But despite these glaring gaps, Cantu was convicted and sentenced to death. During those 8 years he spent on death row, Cantu maintained his innocence, and on the day of his execution, he remained silent as he lay strapped to the gurney, with his attorney watching through a one-way window. Outside of the prison, his mother, Aurelia Cantu, held a candle amongst a group of protesters. She lamented, "He's resting now. He's free, but he shouldn't have been here in the first place." And just like that, Cantu was innocently executed. The tragic irony emerged, though, after his death, when David Garza, Cantu's co-defendant, who had just been 15 at the time of the crime, signed a sworn affidavit admitting that Cantu wasn't present during the murder-robbery. Meanwhile, Juan Moreno, the sole surviving eyewitness, recanted his testimony, stating that he had been pressured by police to identify Cantu. As an undocumented immigrant, Moreno said his fear of authorities led him to comply. Key figures in the trial, including the judge, prosecutor, head juror, and defense attorney, later acknowledged that Cantu's conviction was based on a foundation of omissions and falsehoods, making it crystal clear that he was wrongfully executed by lethal injection.
A lengthy Columbia Law School investigation has revealed the state of Texas executed an innocent man more than 2 decades ago.
Do you believe Carlos DeLuna was actually factually innocent of murder?
I do.
He didn't do it.
I believe that. Looking into it, Carlos DeLuna said all the way along, "I didn't do it. I saw another man do it."
I asked him when he was in death row, I asked him, "Did you do this?" He said, "No, I didn't do it. If you would just go to Corpus, this is where this guy lives. His name is Carlos Hernandez."
Let's go to the evening of February 4th, 1983. Wanda Lopez was working alone at a Shamrock convenience store along the roadside in Corpus Christi, Texas. Now, while on the phone with a 911 dispatcher, a customer attacked her with a knife, stabbing her to death. Police responded swiftly and discovered an eyewitness at the scene who had seen the attacker fleeing. The description given to the officers was that of a Hispanic male wearing a gray sweatshirt. Not far from the store, officers found 20-year-old Carlos DeLuna hiding behind a truck. Now, he was brought back to the scene, where the eyewitness identified him as the assailant. DeLuna, however, told authorities that they had the wrong man. He claimed the true attacker was Carlos Hernandez, a man he had been with earlier that evening at a bar near the Shamrock. According to DeLuna, Hernandez had gone to the store and never returned. Now worried about Hernandez's whereabouts, DeLuna walks over to the Shamrock store in search of him, only to find Hernandez attacking the clerk. DeLuna immediately panicked and ran from the scene because of his troubling past. Now, you see, DeLuna, who had dropped out of school after 7th grade, had an IQ of just 72 and a lengthy criminal record of more than 20 offenses. Most of these were minor, like public drunkenness, though he had previously served time for attempted aggravated rape and vehicular theft. Concerned that his record might implicate him further, DeLuna admitted he hid under a truck when he heard sirens approaching. But despite his account, police never pursued an investigation into Hernandez. The case against DeLuna relied heavily on the testimony of that single witness, Kevin Baker, who had seen the struggle inside the store and observed the attacker fleeing. Years later, Baker admits he wasn't entirely confident about his identification. He said that he struggled to differentiate between Hispanic individuals and that his certainty at the time had been influenced by police informing him about DeLuna being found nearby. I know that's absolutely ridiculous, but it's not even the worst thing about this story. The case was swimming with investigative flaws. Although the crime scene would be drenched in blood, DeLuna had no traces of blood on his clothing or shoes. Prosecutors suggested that the rain may have washed it away, though forensic testing disproved that claim. Key evidence at the scene would be a cigarette stub, chewing gum, beer cans, and a bloody knife, which wasn't properly examined for fingerprints or DNA, yet DeLuna was taken to trial. So at his trial, DeLuna takes the stand, maintaining that Hernandez was the true perpetrator. Prosecutors, however, dismissed Hernandez as a fabrication, describing him as a phantom invented to shift the blame. And the jury would side with the prosecution, convicting DeLuna of murder. Despite multiple appeals, his conviction and death sentence were upheld. And so on December 7, 1989, Carlos DeLuna was executed by lethal injection. However, this is when the true story begins. Columbia University law professor James Liebman conducted a thorough investigation into this case, uncovering overwhelming evidence of DeLuna's innocence. Liebman discovered that the crime scene photos, which weren't shown to the jury, depicted blood spatter throughout the store, yet DeLuna's outfit was entirely clean. He found evidence of gross mishandling during the investigation, like the failure to test critical items from the crime scene for biological evidence. Liebman would also track down multiple witnesses who confirmed the existence of Carlos Hernandez, including individuals who heard Hernandez brag about committing the murder. And you can bet Hernandez also had a history of violence, which included numerous arrests for crimes like armed robbery of gas stations. And just days before Lopez's murder, Hernandez had been found outside a Corpus Christi 7-Eleven armed with a knife. It's despicable thinking that no one, not even the cops, bothered to search for Hernandez or even try to validate DeLuna's claims. But in the end, it was all too late. Carlos Hernandez died in prison in 1999 from natural causes after serving time for stabbing a neighbor with a knife. Had he been exonerated, DeLuna may have had the chance to fulfill his dream of working in faith-based communities. These would be his last words before his execution.
I just wish, people would do something about it and look for somebody, look for that person, and do something about it. Maybe one day the truth will come out, and I'm hoping it will. Because if I end up getting executed for this purpose, I don't think it's right.
The Georgia Pardons Board rejects a last-ditch plea for clemency for Troy Davis, convicted of killing a police officer in 1989.
Concerning the execution of Troy Anthony Davis, he has now been put to death by lethal injection.
We take you to the night of September 21st, 2011. Troy Davis lay strapped to a gurney, moments away from execution. With the weight of his conviction hanging over him, he lifts his head and addresses the family of Mark McPhail, the off-duty police officer he was accused of killing. In a calm yet resolute voice, Davis declared his innocence, maintaining that he did not commit the crime for which he was about to die. At 11:08 p.m., the state of Georgia administered a lethal injection of pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, and potassium chloride, ending Davis's life and closing a chapter fraught with controversy and doubt. His execution became the talk of the town, not only for his supporters, but also for the broader debate about justice and the death penalty. But the number one question here was, what tragic circumstances led to this tragic execution? And was Troy Davis really innocent? Now, to answer this question, we have to go back to one fateful night in 1989, when a police officer named Mark McPhail was moonlighting as a security guard when he intervened in an altercation involving a homeless man, Larry Young, who was being harassed by another guy named Sylvester Red Coles. Now, according to witness accounts, Troy Davis was also present and had reportedly stepped in to defuse the situation. Moments later, gunshots rang out, and Officer McPhail was fatally wounded and killed. Now, Cole admitted to owning a .38 caliber handgun, the same type used in the murder, but he claimed to have disposed of it earlier that evening. Suspicion quickly turned to Davis, who was arrested and charged despite the absence of forensic evidence or even a murder weapon. In 1991, Troy Davis faced trial for Officer McPhail's murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, with 9 individuals linking Davis to the crime. However, cracks in their stories would emerge over time, and 7 of those 9 eyewitnesses later recanted or even altered their testimonies, with some of them saying that they were coerced by cops to give false testimonies. One key witness, Antoine Williams, said that he had signed a police statement that he could neither read nor understand. Yet in the courtroom, these testimonies would form the backbone of the case against Davis. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury had found him guilty of murder and other charges. The sentencing phase saw Davis pleading for his life, asserting his innocence and asking for a second chance. Despite his emotional appeal, the jury sentenced him to death, a decision that would ignite years of legal battles and public outcry. What makes Troy Davis's case particularly troubling is the sheer fragility of the evidence used to convict him. This lack of physical evidence, no murder weapon, no DNA, no fingerprints, meant that the prosecution's case hinged entirely on eyewitness accounts. Over the years, 7 of these eyewitnesses recanted, and some would even admit that they were pressured by law enforcement. Meanwhile, though, new allegations would surface implicating Sylvester Coles, the very man who had first accused Davis. In 2009, another compromised eyewitness, Kiana Glover, testified that she overheard Coles confess to the murder, but her statement came a little too late to alter Davis's legal trajectory. Despite mounting doubt, the courts repeatedly denied Davis a new trial, arguing that he had failed to definitively prove his innocence, a standard that many criticized as being unreasonably high in a death penalty case. As Davis's execution date loomed, the case drew international attention. Protest erupted across the globe, uniting a diverse coalition of supporters. Figures like the former FBI Director William Sessions, Pope Benedict XVI, and even former President Jimmy Carter would call for clemency, joining organizations like Amnesty International and the NAACP in urging Georgia to reconsider. Yet, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency, and the state set September 21st, 2011, as the final execution date. On the morning of his execution, Troy Davis sent a powerful message to Amnesty International, saying, "The fight for justice doesn't end with me. It's a battle for every Troy Davis who came before me, and everyone who comes after me." The words resonated deeply as the day unfolded. But when he got that lethal injection later that evening, the grief and anger amongst his supporters were palpable. For McPhail's family, the execution brought a sense of closure, but for many others, it left a lingering thought. The thought that Davis had just been killed for a crime he never committed.
When you have 7 of 9 of your eyewitnesses changing their stories, if they had done that at the time of the trial, would you have still been able to win a conviction?
If they didn't, is the important thing to know.
We should first underline that there is a family here that has been grieving for many, many years, and that is the family of that slain officer. Their loss is profound. But there are many people who believe that last night, the state of Georgia executed an innocent man.
A Philadelphia man has been on death row for killing a teenager. Today, that conviction was overturned.
I had the guards trying to kill me and set me up, and the prisoners trying to kill me. They tried to light the cell on fire with me in there.
It's October 22nd, 1991. Shadell Ray Williams steps out wearing her cherished $450 gold figure-8 hoop earrings. They were her favorite, but her mother often worried when she wore them because Shadell had already been held at gunpoint for them once before. And the only reason she still had him was her boyfriend paid those thieves over $100 to get him back. But on that fateful day in October, they still hung from her ears as she and her best friend, Zara Howard, both students at Olney High School, boarded the bus after classes, and 2 men approached. One of them, described as approximately 5'9" or 10, with a dark complexion, a broad build, and dressed in a red sweatsuit with a black jacket and white high tops, brandished a silver .32 caliber firearm. He demanded for Shadell's earrings, as both those girls ran away. However, while Zara screamed near a fruit stand on the street, one of the men caught up with Shadell. He ripped her earrings off as she tried to break free, and he pressed the gun close to her neck and shot her. Shadell collapsed, and the men fled to a waiting car. And although more than a dozen people witnessed the incident, the gun and earrings were never recovered. Now, a few days after the murder, photos of a man named Jimmy Dennis, linked to a prior drug possession misdemeanor, were included in this lineup to show witnesses. And weeks later, rumors began circulating that he was involved in the crime and, in fact, was the shooter. So you can imagine to Jimmy this was really concerning because he didn't murder anybody. So he and his father contacted the police through a lawyer to check if he was a suspect. Now get this, the police assured him that there was no warrant. However, as the rumors persisted, Jimmy and his father decided to address the matter directly by visiting the station themselves. Now, despite their efforts, on the morning of November 23, 1991, at around 8:30 a.m., Detective Manuel Santiago and several officers came to Jimmy's home, asking him to accompany them downtown. During questioning led by Santiago and Detective Frank Jastrzemski, Jimmy waived his right to legal counsel. Confident that he had nothing to hide, he shared details about his whereabouts on the day of the murder, explaining that he had stayed at his father's house, taken the bus, and spent some time with friends at practice. He also pointed out that he didn't own a red sweatsuit and hadn't had white sneakers for years. Nevertheless, he was booked for murder that day. And at his trial on October 16, 1992, Jimmy would watch in disbelief as 3 eyewitnesses testified, claiming that they had seen him kill Shadell Williams. This was a surreal nightmare, a case of mistaken identity gone horribly wrong. And despite the absence of physical evidence, Jastrzemski testified about seizing items from Jimmy's father's home, including red pants, black waist-length jackets, and low-top white sneakers, which were similar to what witnesses described the shooter wearing. So based on these eyewitness testimonies, poor Jimmy was sentenced to death just 3 days later. The thought of being executed was one thing, but the horrors he faced on death row was definitely not something Jimmy was prepared for. I mean, we all know death row's designed not for rehabilitation, but for suffering. And in Jimmy's case, he had no shortage of that. He spent roughly 22 hours a day confined to a cell, with brief cage-like breaks for yard time or library visits. Showers were limited to 10 minutes on 3 days a week, and meals came through a slot on trays often marked with hateful carvings. He was given a single 10-minute phone call each month, and this was the only time he got to speak with his family. These conditions take a toll, and like many inmates, Jimmy began experiencing signs of mental decline. Before his conviction, Jimmy had been a member of a promising R&B group called Sensation, and behind bars, his music became his solace. He would be driven by a fierce determination to prove his innocence and would reach out to universities and organizations for free legal resources, transforming his cell into a makeshift law library. Through prison pen pal networks, he would share his story, gradually building a group of supporters and a dedicated legal team. Now, one of his earliest advocates was Amy Rowe, who began working on his case in 2000, just a few years into her legal career. Alongside lawyers from a law firm, Arnold & Porter, she took on Jimmy's case pro bono, navigating years of appeals and setbacks in state courts before moving to federal court. Finally, in 2013, U.S. District Court Judge Anita B. Brody reviewed Jimmy's case and overturned his conviction. She cited significant flaws, including unreliable eyewitness accounts, suppressed exculpatory evidence, and a lackluster defense that failed to interview any witnesses. Judge Brody described the case as a grave miscarriage of justice, which it truly was. May 13, 2017, Jimmy was finally released from SCI Green after nearly 9,000 days behind bars. That's roughly 25 years. And then on April 25, 2024, a Philadelphia jury awarded him $16 million in damages. That's $10 million from the city and $6 million collectively from detectives involved in his wrongful conviction. While the compensation was substantial, one has to wonder, can it ever truly make up for 25 years lost? I guess that's a question only Jimmy can answer.
And I thank you for it, from the bottom of my heart.
With tears in his eyes, Clemente Aguirre thanked his team, his family, and the judge who told him his 15-year nightmare is over.
We've seen innocent people sent to death row for crimes they had no connection to, with zero evidence against them. What happens when detectives link multiple pieces of evidence to someone for a double murder, only for that person to turn out innocent? Like, how do you even explain that? Well, on June 17, 2004, the bodies of 47-year-old Cheryl Williams and 68-year-old Carol Barries were discovered in their Altamonte Springs, Florida residence. Now, Williams had been stabbed over 100 times, while Barries had suffered 2 stab wounds. A blood-stained 10-inch kitchen knife would be located between their house and a neighboring house. Now, when cops arrived at the scene, Samantha Williams, Cheryl's daughter, immediately expressed her gut feeling that the culprit was 24-year-old Clemente Aguirre, their next-door neighbor. Clemente Aguirre, a Honduran immigrant employed as a dishwasher and a food prep worker at a restaurant, was questioned by police alongside his roommate. Neither claimed to have knowledge of the crime. However, Aguirre later admitted that he had entered the neighboring home the previous evening in search of a beer and had encountered the dead bodies. He was arrested for evidence tampering, and while in custody, investigators noted similarities between the knife and those used at Aguirre's workplace, where a 10-inch knife was reportedly missing. At this point, Aguirre was the prime suspect, and he was subsequently charged with first-degree murder and burglary. In 2006, he would stand trial, and experts testified that 64 out of 67 bloody footprints found at the scene matched his footwear. Additionally, traces of Williams and Barry's blood were identified on clothing found in a plastic bag in Aguirre's home. His fingerprint was also discovered on the knife used in both murders. And now during the trial, Aguirre would recount his version of events. He claimed that on the night of the murders, he entered the house through an always unlocked front door to ask for a beer. But when he got inside, he found Cheryl Williams' body and attempted to revive her. After spotting Barissa's body in another room, he feared the perpetrator might still be present. He picked up the knife near Cheryl's body to defend himself while searching for the killer. Finding no one, he fled back to his house, discarded the knife, placed his clothes in a bag, and cleaned up. He didn't contact authorities, fearing deportation. I mean, it's really hard for any competent jury to believe those claims, especially because he never mentioned any of that information before. So, this only meant one thing. Aguirre was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary, and he was sentenced to death. Now in 2011, after 5 years on death row, a nonprofit legal organization, the Innocence Project, initiated DNA testing on over 80 pieces of evidence. The results excluded Aguirre as the DNA source and instead revealed Samantha Williams' DNA in 8 key locations. Samantha was later called in for questioning, where she confessed to killing her mother and Barry's. Furthermore, a forensic scientist determined that the blood on Aguirre's clothing wasn't splatter, but consistent with the efforts to resuscitate the victims. I mean, how lucky can you get? And following some more legal battles, the Florida Supreme Court granted Aguirre a retrial in October 2016. The first attempt ended in a mistrial during jury selection, but the second one, prosecutors would abruptly drop all charges before the jury could even be seated, and Aguirre was set free. This poor man spent 10 years on death row. We jump back to November 30th, 1949. And Timothy Evans erratically informs police in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, that his wife passed away under strange circumstances. No one knows why he acted that way, but it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. After a few hours of interrogation, Evans made his first confession. He told officers that his wife, Beryl, was pregnant with their second child and that he had provided her with a liquid to terminate the pregnancy. Tragically, the attempt went horribly wrong, and Beryl accidentally died as a result. He also confessed to placing her body in a manhole near their home at 10 Rillington Place in London, before secretly arranging for their daughter, Geraldine, to be cared for by some relatives. And once that was taken care of, he fled to Wales. However, when police inspected the drain outside the building's front, they saw nothing. In addition, they found that it would take at least 3 officers to lift that manhole cover. Now, if you were the police, what would you think? That Evans deliberately killed his wife, or worse, that he murdered both his wife and daughter. Because at that moment, they were both already dead. For context here, Evans wasn't the brightest of people. He struggled in school, as well as many other things in life. But in 1940, he married Beryl Thorley. Initially, they stayed with his mother, but after she got pregnant, they moved into an upstairs flat at 10 Rillington Place, just a short distance from his mother's home. On October 10th of that year, their daughter Geraldine was born. However, their marriage was far from happy. Evans grew frustrated with Beryl's untidiness, and meanwhile she would hate that he came home drunk every night. Plus, they had huge financial issues coupled with bad spending habits. So in November 1949, when Evans discovered his wife was pregnant with their second child, he wanted to get rid of that pregnancy. However, things didn't go as planned. And while his neighbors believed that he had abandoned his family, something far more sinister was at play. Evans was re-questioned and he recanted his initial statements and gave a second confession. He implicated his downstairs neighbor, John Christie, claiming Christie had offered to perform an abortion. Evans would say that he had left Christie out of his first statement in order to protect him, as the procedure was illegal in UK at the time. On the morning of that procedure, he left Christie with his wife for work. Christie informed him that his wife had died and advised Evans to leave London for the meantime. Evans also claimed Christie assured him that he would dispose of her body in a manhole and arrange for Geraldine to be adopted by a suitable couple. Now, Evans was taken to the Notting Hill police station, and there he was informed that during a second search of the property, officers had discovered the bodies of a woman and a child in the old wash house. Both had been strangled. Evans was shown items of clothing retrieved from the bodies, which he identified as belonging to Beryl and Geraldine. At this point, Evans was pressured into signing a third confession. Unlike his previous ones, this one sounded less like him and more like a polished account for the police. In this confession, Evan admits to strangling Beryl during an argument over money and then claimed to have killed his daughter Geraldine 2 days later before fleeing to Wales. The police gave Evans all the details needed to make his confession sound believable, and they may have even edited it later during transcription. On top of that, he would spend 2 days in solitary confinement and was interrogated late at night and early in the morning, which would only add to his emotional and physical exhaustion, especially since he was already deeply distressed. So in court, Evans said that he was afraid the police might hurt him if he didn't confess. That fear, combined with the shock of finding out both his wife and daughter had been strangled, completely overwhelmed him with guilt. He was devastated that he couldn't protect his daughter, whose murder came as a massive shock. All of this likely pushed him into making a false confession. Crucial evidence that could have supported his alibi was also mishandled. Records from his workplace, which might have established his whereabouts, were obtained by the police, but mysteriously disappeared and were never seen again. Meanwhile, children playing near a bomb site close to Rillington Place would come across a skull and turned it over to the police, but that discovery was ignored. You had the builders working at Evans' apartment complex at the time saying they didn't see any bodies in the wash house, but they were persuaded by the police to change those stories. January 11th, 1950, Timothy Evans' trial began. This guy was convicted solely for his daughter's murder. However, evidence related to Beryl's death was introduced to tie him to his daughter's killing. Ultimately, the case boiled down to Evans' word against that of his prosecutors and his confession. Evans took back his confession in court and pointed the finger at Christie, claiming that he was the real killer. His defense lawyer tried highlighting Christie's shady past, mentioning his time in prison for hitting a woman with a cricket bat and his reputation as a petty thief. But proving Christie's guilt wasn't easy. The defense just couldn't come up with a solid motive, and Christie's testimony was backed by his wife, Ethel, which added weight to his story. The trial was shockingly brief, just 3 days. When the judge addressed the jury, he painted a picture that was far from the truth, twisting the case in ways that left a little room for doubt in their minds. Almost everyone was convinced Timothy Evans was guilty, and it took the jury only 40 minutes to decide his fate. Even the people advocating for him focused more on ending capital punishment than on proving his innocence. Finally, on March 9, 1950, Timothy Evans was hanged. Meanwhile, his downstairs neighbor, John Christie, faced his own problems after the trial. His criminal history, revealed in court, got him fired from the post office where he worked, and he also struggled to find another job, so by 1953, he was out of money. Desperate, he would illegally sublet his flat at 10 Rillington Place, pocket the rent, and then vanish. But that's when things became interesting. The new tenant there wasted no time making changes to the flat. However, while peeling off old wallpaper in the kitchen, they stumbled upon a hidden closet. Inside were the decomposing bodies of 3 women. Oh, it doesn't stop there. Further searches of the apartment unearthed 2 skeletons buried in the garden, one missing its skull. Astonishingly, the police had missed all this during earlier investigations. Under the floorboards, they found Christie's wife, Ethel, the same woman who had stood by his testimony during Evans' trial. A search for Christie was launched, and it didn't take long before they found him. Now, while in custody, Christie confessed 4 different times to killing Beryl, and he denied agreeing to perform an abortion, claiming instead that Beryl died during an intimate moment and then later claimed that he helped her commit suicide. He also insisted he hadn't murdered Geraldine. However, this official inquiry concluded in 1966 said that Christie had in fact murdered Evans's daughter as well. Disturbingly, Christie admitted that he might have engaged in sexual acts with Beryl's corpse, though he claimed he wasn't certain. And then combine his habit with hiring prostitutes, this behavior pointed to a deeply troubling history of violence and necrophilia that likely extended far beyond the bodies discovered at his former apartment. So, on July 15, 1953, John Christie faced the same fate as Evans, hanging. And the same executioner who hanged Timothy Evans 3 years earlier carried out the job. As the noose was being adjusted, Christie complained about an itchy nose. But the hangman sinisterly replied, "It won't bother you for long." Now, the United States ain't the only nation that still enforces capital punishment. And they're certainly not the only ones who've sentenced the wrong people to death row. Japan has made a few mistakes as well, and in their case, the innocent man they imprisoned unfortunately now holds the infamous world record for the longest serving death row inmate. Yeah, you heard that right. And no, it's not the worst thing about the case. You see, back in September 2024, an 88-year-old man recognized as the longest-serving death row inmate in the world was acquitted by a Japanese court after he determined that the evidence used to convict him had been falsified. Iwao Hakamada, who spent nearly 50 damn years on death row, was originally convicted in 1968 for the murders of his employer, the employer's wife, and their 2 children. His initial conviction was based on a confession Hakamada claimed he gave under duress, after getting aggressively interrogated for up to 12 hours daily, as well as some blood-stained clothing presented as evidence in court. Now, before getting roped into this crime, Hakamada was a pro boxer who worked a side job in a factory in 1966 when the bodies of his boss, the boss's wife, and their 2 children were discovered in an aftermath of a fire at their residence. All 4 had been fatally stabbed before their home got burnt down. Authorities accused Hakamada of committing these murders, setting the home ablaze, and then stealing 200,000 yen. Although he initially denied involvement, he later confessed, which was pretty weird to his supporters, but also earned him the death sentence. Now, after more than 3 decades behind bars, Hakamada's legal team argued that the blood-stained clothes prosecutors claimed belonged to him didn't even carry his DNA and may have been planted. Finally, in 2014, a judge agreed with the defense, and Hakamada was released and granted a retrial. The retrial process, however, stretched on for years as Hakamada was battling serious health issues. I mean, for a guy who spent most of his life behind bars, you can probably expect multiple health complications. But anyways, in September 2024, Hakamada's legal team was ready. They argued that those stains on the supposed blood-stained clothing had darkened over time, which would have been expected if they'd been immersed in soybean paste for an extended period. This support claims that the evidence had been tampered with. The court ultimately ruled that the investigators had fabricated the evidence, staining the clothing with blood before hiding it in the miso tank. And on this basis, Hakamada was declared innocent. Japan, along with the US, is one of the few G7 nations that continue to enforce capital punishment. But in Japan, death row inmates are notified of their execution mere hours before it's carried out. I mean, that's disturbing. And so were the other 7 cases in this video. If you really think about it, capital punishment is one of society's biggest paradoxes. On the surface, it feels like some kind of justice for the worst crimes, a way to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But what happens when the system gets it wrong? What about the innocent lives like Carlos DeLuna, Timothy Evans, and Troy Davis that get lost to wrongful executions? Doesn't that make the system itself a killer? Are we so sure that people are beyond redemption? If killing is wrong, how do we justify killing in return? I mean, honestly, it's a tough debate, because while the death penalty might feel necessary for some crimes, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, it forces us to ask, do we have the right to play judge, jury, and executioner? And if we were to make a mistake, how do we live with that? Let us know what you're thinking in the comment section down below.
Maybe in some books of justice, the person for this act deserves to die, but do we, as a society, deserve to kill them?